Cowboy posted an ad for a farm maid, not a wife, but the deaf Apache woman changed his life forever. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Billy Harrow finished securing the last section of fencing just as the sun lowered toward the ridge, casting long shadows across the dry ground. His hands were stiff from a morning spent working with wire and tools that had grown too familiar over the years. He wiped his palms on his coat and surveyed the pasture with the quiet vigilance that had shaped his life since he moved to the outskirts of Dust Bend 8 years earlier. Loss had pushed him towards solitude. Routine kept him steady. His mission had become simple: keep the ranch functioning and avoid the noise of town. He stepped toward the barn to store his tools when something unusual caught his eye. The dirt path leading from the main road held a new pattern of footprints. They were narrow, spaced unevenly, and paused often in a way that didn't match the stride of a confident traveler. Whoever made them had been cautious, possibly exhausted. Billy crouched and studied the impressions, feeling his chest tighten with a mix of curiosity and tension. He rarely had visitors. Anyone appearing without warning usually brought trouble or demands he didn't want to entertain. As he straightened, movement near the gate stopped him cold. A woman stood there, still as a fence post, watching him with a guarded expression. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands, pushed by the faint breeze. Her deerskin dress was worn thin, patched in multiple places, showing signs of heavy travel through rough terrain. Her arms were crossed over her chest in a protective posture, not aggressive, but deeply cautious. She seemed prepared for rejection. Billy's throat tightened out of instinct. He had seen many people pass through Dust Bend, cowhands looking for coin, families searching for land, wanderers hiding from the past, but he had not seen an Apache woman alone at his gate before. The territory was not kind to her people. Many never approached a white man's ranch unless desperation outweighed fear. She raised her hands slowly, movements deliberate and practiced. She signed a single name, Naya. Then she touched her throat, shook her head, and lowered her eyes. She could not hear him. She had likely never heard anything for most of her life. Billy felt his pulse quicken. He had no experience communicating with someone who relied on signs. He barely spoke much himself. Silence had been his shield ever since his wife died years ago, leaving him with a ranch too big for one man and a heart he didn't want exposed to strangers' demands. Naya reached into the small pouch at her side and unfolded a paper with both hands. The edges were creased, dirt-smudged, and softened from being held tightly. Billy recognized it immediately. The advertisement he had posted at the general store. Farm Maid wanted. Room and meals provided. He had written it because winter was coming and his workload had grown heavier than his body could manage alone. He expected a local woman, maybe someone widowed or needing coin. Not this. Not a solitary Apache traveler who had walked far enough for the paper to wear thin in her grasp. She held it out to him with steady arms, waiting for his judgment. Her eyes did not plead, yet they showed the strain of someone whose options had run out. The faint tremor in her fingers revealed hunger and fatigue more than fear. She did not step closer or explain herself. She simply offered the paper and let him choose. Billy looked at her longer than he intended. Her presence stirred a tension he couldn't name, part concern, part instinct, part something else. Turning her away would be easy. Many men would have done it without thinking. But she had survived something on the road. He saw it in the way she shifted her weight lightly, always prepared to react. She had traveled without sound to guide her. She had followed written words she could not hear spoken. Billy stepped toward the gate and pulled it open. The decision came from a place inside him he rarely listened to anymore, a space that hadn't closed entirely despite years of silence. Naya inhaled sharply, almost unnoticeably, the kind of breath someone takes after bracing for refusal. She stepped inside the yard with controlled movements, scanning the barn, the fence line, the house, the slope of the land. She assessed the space not as a guest, but as someone who needed to know if she could survive here. Billy walked ahead, keeping his posture calm so she could read him. She followed with steady but careful steps, her body tight with the habit of expecting danger. Inside the house, she paused just past the doorway, waiting for permission to move further. Billy nodded toward the chair at the table. She sat upright, hands folded in her lap, studying the room with sharp focus. The house was simple: wooden table, iron stove, shelves stacked neatly. Tools hung where he could find them in the dark. His old life lingered in the corners, but most memories had been packed into silence. He placed a tin cup of water in front of her. She lifted her eyes to him before drinking, making sure she wasn't misreading the gesture. Then she took slow, steady sips, each one small enough to show how long thirst had been shadowing her journey. Billy leaned against the counter, assessing her quietly. He noticed how she watched the sway of a lantern, the vibration of his boots against the floorboards, the movement of his hands. She built her understanding of the world through motion. Her presence unsettled him in a way that didn't feel threatening, just unfamiliar. He had spent too many years alone. He wasn't used to another person reacting to every shift in his posture, every signal he gave without realizing. When he pointed toward the spare room, she rose immediately. Her posture relaxed a fraction, though her eyes stayed alert. She walked to the small room at the end of the hall and placed her pouch in the corner. She touched the blanket on the bed with the careful pressure of someone who rarely trusted comfort. Then she sat, her breathing easing as she studied her new surroundings. Billy remained in the main room, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of another person settling into his house. The quiet changed, not louder, but different, shared in a way that made the walls feel less hollow. Outside, the sun dropped behind a ridge. Naya's footsteps softened as she adjusted to the room. Billy tightened the latch on the front door, his chest unexpectedly lighter. He had asked for help with chores. He had not expected a woman running from an unseen storm. He had not expected to feel something shift inside him the moment she crossed his gate. But she was here now, and he had let her in. The rest would unfold one quiet step at a time. Billy woke before sunrise, as he always did, but the presence of another person in the house changed the silence in a way he could not ignore. The spare room door was closed, yet he could sense someone behind it, a weight he wasn't used to but didn't resent. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, absorbing the unfamiliar feeling of not being entirely alone. He stepped into the main room and lit the stove. The soft crackle of dry would fill the air. As he set a pot of water to warm, the door to the spare room opened slowly. Naya appeared with measured steps, her hair loose and slightly tangled from sleep. She paused near the doorway, watching him with the same alertness she had shown the night before, unsure whether she should speak through gesture or wait for instruction. Billy motioned toward the table, not demanding, just guiding. She approached and sat with her posture straight, hands resting lightly on her knees. He placed a tin plate of bread and beans in front of her. She hesitated, studying his face to be certain it was for her, then nodded once and began to eat small bites, careful and controlled. While she ate, Billy stepped outside to check the livestock. The cold morning air tightened the skin on his cheeks. Frost clung to the fence posts, and the breath of the animals drifted like faint smoke. Routine grounded him. It reminded him who he was before strangers arrived at his gate. But when he returned to the house, he saw that Naya had finished eating and was washing the dishes in a metal basin. She dried them with the rag he kept on the stove's hook, arranging each item exactly where she had found it. Her precision surprised him. She had studied the room long enough to know every placement. Billy picked up his gloves and motioned toward the yard. She stood immediately, ready to follow. Her steps were light but steady, as though she tracked the ground through touch rather than sound. Outside, the wind carried sharp chill. Billy led her to the barn, pointing at a stack of empty feed sacks. She understood, gathering them into a neat pile without hesitation. He watched how she handled each task. No wasted movement, no confusion, just quiet observation followed by swift execution. When they entered the barn, the horse lifted its head toward them. Naya moved slowly, offering her hand so the animal could recognize her scent. She waited until the horse relaxed before brushing its mane with long strokes. Billy noted how naturally she communicated through touch. It wasn't something he expected, and it eased a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. He repaired a loose latch on the stall door while she swept the straw into orderly rows. Every so often she glanced at him, checking whether her work matched what he needed. He didn't speak, but his nods guided her. Midway through the morning, Billy stepped outside to gather tools for the fence line. Naya followed, holding the toolbox he pointed to. She carried it without strain, her steps careful over uneven ground. When they reached a section where the wires sagged, she knelt beside him and held the post steady while he tightened the line. Her grip did not shake. Her attention stayed on the task, not the cold biting at her fingers. Billy felt something shift inside him, a sense of partnership he had not felt since his wife was alive. It unsettled him, but it also grounded him in a way he didn't expect. As they worked, Naya paused and touched the soil near her foot. She traced a set of faint impressions, boot marks from someone who had passed earlier. She looked up at Billy with a focused expression, alerting him without alarm. He crouched to inspect the tracks, noting the direction and depth. Strangers had crossed his land recently. He didn't like that. Naya watched his jaw tighten. She didn't know the details of his past, but she recognized the unease in his body language. She stepped slightly closer, not touching him, but making her presence clear, as if to say she understood trouble when she saw it. Billy took a slow breath and finished the repair. When he rose, she handed him the hammer without being asked. Their hands brushed briefly, neither pulling away immediately. By midday, the sun had warmed the ground enough for them to sit on the porch steps. Billy cut 2 slices of bread and handed her one. She accepted with a slight tilt of her head, signaling gratitude. As she ate, she examined the sky, the barn, the fence, the distant hills. She was mapping her new environment, studying every detail to judge whether she could trust it. Billy drank from his canteen, watching her quietly. He wondered where she had come from, how long she had been traveling, and what had driven her to answer his advertisement despite the danger of approaching a stranger's land. He had questions, but he didn't press. Silence felt safer for both of them. The afternoon brought more work, feeding cattle, clearing debris near the well, gathering firewood. They moved through each chore in steady cooperation. Naya never asked for a break, never complained, and never hurried. Her movements were grounded, disciplined, shaped by a history Billy didn't yet know. As the sun lowered again, she stood near the porch with her hands clasped lightly, waiting for Billy's final instruction of the day. He opened the front door and motioned for her to come inside. She stepped in with a calm expression that held something new, relief mixed with the faint beginnings of trust. Inside, she placed her small pouch on the floor near the shelf he had built the night before. She straightened its edges and touched the wood lightly, acknowledging the space he had offered. Billy watched from across the room, feeling the day settle on his shoulders. Having her here shifted the air in ways he couldn't describe. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar and strangely steadying. Naya lowered herself onto the chair by the stove, warming her hands. Billy sat at the table, observing her quietly. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked present. Their first full day together ended without a single spoken word. Yet more had been communicated than Billy expected when he opened his gate to a traveler he didn't know. The ranch no longer felt like one man's burden. It felt like 2 people learning how to occupy the same space without disrupting each other's fragile balance. The third morning began colder than the last. A thin mist clung to the ground, settling over the ranch in a pale layer that blurred the usual outlines of the yard. Billy stepped outside with his coat buttoned tightly, scanning the property out of habit before touching anything. He had learned long ago that trouble often announced itself in small ways. Changes in the soil, disturbances in the air, objects left slightly out of place. Naya emerged from the house moments later, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth she had repurposed from her belongings. She paused on the porch, feeling the planks beneath her feet for vibration. When she noticed Billy checking the barn doors, she joined him without needing instruction. She carried herself with quiet purpose, ready to assist. Billy approached the barn first. The latch hung at a slight angle, not broken but shifted enough to catch his attention. He froze. Someone unfamiliar would not have noticed such a small change, but Billy knew every hinge and board of this place. His jaw tightened as he leaned closer to inspect it. Naya watched him carefully. She had learned his body language in only 2 days, the stiffening of his shoulders when he sensed danger, the way his breathing slowed when he judged risk. She stepped closer to the door and touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers. The wood held a faint indentation where it had been pushed too hard. Her eyes narrowed with recognition. Billy opened the door slowly. Everything inside looked normal at first glance. Tools arranged neatly, feed sacks stacked as they had left them the day before. Yet he moved inside with deliberate caution. Naya followed, scanning the floorboards. She spotted something at the far corner. A few grains of dirt scattered near the wall. Not ordinary barn dust, but fresh soil with a different texture. She crouched and lifted a pinch between her fingers, studying it with focus. Then she pointed toward the ground outside, signaling the source was beyond the barn. Billy stepped outside again, this time with sharpened attention. Together, they moved toward the southern fence. The mist made it difficult to see far distances, but the ground was soft enough to capture footprints clearly. Near a cluster of brush, Naya stopped abruptly. She knelt and traced a short pattern of impressions. 2 sets of tracks, different boot sizes, both recent. Billy lowered himself beside her, examining the spacing and direction. The footsteps curved around the edge of his land, as if circling, not passing through. He felt something cold settle in his stomach. Strangers casing property rarely came with good intentions. Naya looked up at him, her face calm but serious. She tapped the track twice, then pointed back toward the barn door. She had connected the disturbance with the earlier shift in the latch. Her ability to detect details he missed unsettled him and impressed him at once. He nodded, signaling he understood. They continued along the fence line. While Billy replaced a loose wire, Naya positioned herself where she could watch the open field. She didn't fidget or drift. She stood steady, scanning with practiced discipline. She moved like someone used to traveling under threat, always aware, never fully at ease. When Billy finished the repair, she walked ahead, gesturing toward an area near the property boundary. A small piece of cloth hung torn for a low branch. She plucked it free and examined the weave. It wasn't Apache. It wasn't anything she recognized from her own belongings. It belonged to whoever had crossed Billy's land at dawn. Billy's expression darkened. He hated unknowns on his property. The last time he ignored signs of trouble, he paid a price he couldn't forget. The woman beside him didn't know that history, but she sensed the tension tightening across his shoulders. As they returned to the house, Naya stayed close but unobtrusive. She walked slightly behind him, watching the horizon, habitually protecting her blind side by using the environment as cover. Inside, Billy placed the piece of cloth on the table. Naya sat across from him and touched the wood twice, a gesture she used when she wanted acknowledgement before communicating. He met her eyes. She lifted her hand and signed slowly, "Not gone. We'll come again." Her expression left no room for doubt. Billy absorbed her warning. He didn't question her certainty. Someone had been on his land. Someone had tested the doors. Someone had left signs that were meant to be noticed. He reached for his gloves, needing movement to settle the rising tension. Naya stood too, ready to follow, but he motioned gently for her to stay. She hesitated, then obeyed, though her eyes followed him with concern. Billy stepped outside to check the perimeter alone. The air had warmed slightly, but the unease inside him remained sharp. As he walked the yard, he thought about the last time strangers brought trouble. He had rebuilt his life after that, brick by brick, in silence. He didn't want anyone pulling apart the fragile steadiness he'd created. When he returned, Naya was sweeping near the stove, her movements slow but attentive. She didn't intrude on his worry, but she didn't ignore it either. When he passed her, she touched his forearm lightly, offering a moment of grounding. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He accepted it without speaking. The rest of the day unfolded in steady work, mending tools, stacking firewood, preparing for colder nights. But the atmosphere had shifted. They moved together with more alertness. Their steps aligned without planning. Trust emerged through action, not conversation. As dusk settled over the land, Billy stood at the doorway and watched Naya close the shutters with quiet precision. She double-checked, each latched the same way he always did. She hadn't seen the ghosts of his past, but she understood danger well enough to match his caution. When the final light faded, she stepped back into the main room. Billy met her eyes briefly, acknowledging her awareness, her help, and her growing place in the home. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The ranch had changed in only 3 days. He was no longer facing the land alone. She was no longer traveling without shelter. And whoever had stepped across his property at dawn would soon learn they were not dealing with a house of one anymore. By noon the following day, the air carried the dry sharpness that usually arrived before a storm. The sky showed no dark clouds, but the wind shifted in a way that made Billy uneasy. He was repairing a broken latch on the feed shed when he heard the distant crunch of hooves. Not hurried, not casual, but with the heavy confidence of men who assumed they were welcome anywhere. Billy set his tools down slowly. His back stiffened as he listened to the rhythm of the horses. 2 riders, not 3. The spacing suggested they rode side by side, not leaders and followers. Trouble often traveled in pairs. Naya emerged from behind the barn, carrying a bucket. She paused mid-step, head slightly tilted, not at the sound, but at the faint vibration of hooves traveling through the ground. Her eyes narrowed as she turned toward the road. When she spotted the silhouettes nearing the gate, she placed the bucket down and stepped closer to Billy, watching his reaction. The riders came into clear view. Eli Weaver and Morris Tate, known in town for pushing boundaries until someone forced them back. Billy had kept his distance from them for years. They carried themselves with a loose confidence that made ordinary men uneasy. The horses slowed to a stop near the fence. Eli spat into the dirt, his gaze sliding from Billy to Naya with a lingering stare that revealed his intentions before he said a word. Morris shifted in his saddle, smirking, gauging how far he could push. Naya's body tightened, her stance lowering slightly, as if preparing to retreat or defend. Her eyes stayed locked on their hands, watching for sudden movements. She had lived around danger long enough to read it in posture alone. Billy stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Naya and the riders. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, solid, deliberate, unmovable. Eli pointed with his chin toward Naya, his expression smug. Didn't figure you'd hire one of them. Billy didn't respond. He kept his face unreadable, waiting for the next move. Morris leaned forward, resting his forearms on the saddle horn. Town's been talking. Some folks don't want Apache wandering around white land. Naya's jaw tightened with restrained tension. She remained still, but her breathing deepened, bracing herself without showing fear. Billy spoke at last, his voice low and flat. She works here. Eli laughed under his breath. You're braver than most, letting her stay under your roof. Billy's eyes did not shift. She works here, he repeated, firmer this time. The tone made Eli's smile fade. Morris straightened, sizing up the situation more carefully now that he realized Billy wasn't bluffing. Dust rolled across the ground between them, settling into the silence that followed. Eli nudged his horse a step forward, testing boundaries. You sure you know what you're letting into your home? Billy stepped half a pace nearer, not aggressive but impossible to ignore. She works here. That's all you need to know. Morris glanced at Naya, then at Billy. Something in Billy's stance, calm but unyielding, made him back down first. He pulled the reins lightly. Come on, Morris muttered to Eli. Ain't worth it. Eli hesitated, searching Billy's face for any crack in the wall he presented. He found none. He clicked his tongue, turned his horse, and rode away with a final glare that promised this wasn't the last time they'd test him. As the riders left, Naya exhaled carefully. Her shoulders dropped from their guarded position, though her hands remained tense at her sides. She watched the men until they disappeared beyond the bend in the road. Billy turned to her. She lifted her hands and signed something small but waited. Danger. Then she tapped her chest, signaling she understood why he had placed himself in front of her. He gave a slow nod. He had not made many choices for anyone but himself in years. But blocking those men from reaching her had required no thought. It was instinct. Naya took a step closer. She touched her palm to her chest, then extended her hand toward him. A gesture of respect, not submission. It was her way of acknowledging what he had done without needing words. Billy accepted the gesture with a slight nod. They didn't linger on it. They returned to work, but something in the air between them had changed. That afternoon, Naya worked closer to him than before. She carried tools, handed him nails, swept the shed, and kept glancing toward the road to ensure the riders did not return. Billy caught her watching and didn't correct her. Her vigilance mirrored his own in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. Later, as the sun lowered, Billy reinforced the gate with an additional board. Naya assisted by holding it in place. Their hands brushed once, brief and unplanned, but neither pulled away quickly. That moment stayed lodged in both their minds as they walked back to the house. Inside, Naya double-checked each shutter before settling near the stove. Billy noticed the deliberate care in her movements. She wasn't panicking, but preparing. She had lived through enough threats to trust patterns over promises. Billy watched her as he removed his coat. She wasn't just helping him keep the ranch running. She was becoming part of the quiet defense that made the land feel secure. When night fell, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Events had carved a new understanding into the space between them. They were no longer strangers working on the same land. They were two people standing on shared ground, ready to face whatever came next, together, even if no words had been exchanged. The day's tension did not fade quickly. Even after Eli and Morris disappeared down the road, a heaviness lingered across the ranch like a presence that refused to leave. Billy felt in the air as he finished stacking wood behind the barn. Naya sensed it in the way he moved, more quietly than usual, more deliberate when checking the latch on every door. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low enough that long streaks of orange fell across the yard. Billy wiped the sweat from his brow and turned toward the house. He expected Naya to be inside preparing something simple for supper, yet he found her near the well instead, rinsing a metal pot. Her movements were slow, almost too controlled, as if her mind replayed the scene from earlier. She looked up when he approached. There was no visible fear in her expression, only deep thought. She tapped the rim of the pot lightly, her way of acknowledging him without interrupting his approach. Billy didn't speak, but scanned the yard again. Seeing no sign of the riders brought a small measure of relief. They walked toward the house together. Naya matched her steps to his, not out of subservience, but because she had recognized his habits and adjusted to them. Inside, the stove crackled with fresh kindling. She had already built a steady flame and set the pot on its surface. Billy sat at the table, pulling off his gloves. Naya stood across from him and signed slowly. More danger will come. She formed each shape clearly so he could learn her rhythm. Billy listened with full attention. Her warning wasn't dramatic. It was factual. He nodded, his jaw tightening. I know. She watched his lips, understanding enough to read his concern. As the meal cooked, Naya prepared vegetables with a small knife, slicing them into thin strips. She kept her eyes on her hands, but remained aware of Billy's position at all times. When she finished, she placed the ingredients into the pot and stirred with quiet precision. Billy rose and approached the shelf he had made for her earlier in the week. Something new sat on it, a folded blanket, washed and neatly arranged. Beside it rested a comb she had crafted from a piece of wood. He hadn't seen her making it, yet it looked polished, shaped, and smoothed with care. It struck him in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't treating the shelf as temporary storage. She was organizing it as if she intended to stay. He cleared his throat softly and returned to the table, unsure why the small change affected him so deeply. When Naya brought him a bowl of stew, she placed it gently in front of him. Her fingers brushed the edge of the wooden surface, steadying herself. She sat across from him, eating her portion with calm concentration. They didn't attempt conversation, but their glances found each other more often than before. Near the end of the meal, Naya studied the coat draped over the back of his chair. The sleeve seam had torn earlier during work. She stood, retrieved the needle and thread, she carried in her pouch and sat closer to the lamplight. With steady hands, she began mending the rip without being asked. Billy watched in silence. The sound of the needles slipping through cloth filled the room in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Naya leaned closer to the light, her eyes narrowing as she tightened each stitch with practiced care. She didn't look up until she was finished. When she held the coat out to him, her gaze carried a small flicker of pride. He accepted it with both hands. "Good work," he said quietly. Her eyes shifted to his lips, then to the coat, and she nodded once, small but meaningful. As the fire settled into a steady glow, Naya gathered her belongings from the table and placed them on her shelf. Billy noticed the difference. The items were arranged deliberately, not scattered or temporary. She ran her hand across the wood again, smoothing the surface gently, as if claiming it in her own silent way. Billy leaned back in his chair, observing her without judgment. Her presence no longer felt like an intrusion. Instead, it brought a steadiness to the house he hadn't realized he'd been missing. When Naya finished her tasks, she walked toward the window to close the shutters. She checked the latch twice, mirroring Billy's habit from the night before. She wasn't mimicking him for approval. She was doing it because she understood why he did it. Billy met her gaze when she turned back toward him. That look held something new, recognition of shared responsibility. Before heading to her room, Naya approached the table. She placed her hand lightly near his, not touching, not demanding, just close enough that he felt the warmth of her presence. She held it there for half a second, then withdrew gently. Billy didn't move. The gesture rooted him in place, steady and real. When she disappeared into the doorway, he finally breathed deeply. The house felt different, less empty, less uncertain. Whatever lay ahead, they were beginning to face it as more than strangers. The evening closed with a sense of quiet alignment, as if the ranch itself had shifted subtly to make space for two lives slowly threading into one continuous rhythm. The next morning arrived with a sharp change in the air. Billy noticed at the moment he stepped outside. The sky carried a pale heaviness, and the wind had a cold bite that hadn't been there the day before. He walked across the yard, boots crunching on the stiff earth. A thin dusting of white covered the fence rails. Snow had come early. He tightened his coat and looked back toward the house. Naya stepped on the porch wrapped in a blanket, her breath forming faint clouds. She moved slowly, adjusting her balance on the icy boards. When she looked up at the sky, her expression shifted. She read the weather not through sound, but through the way the air pressed against her skin. Billy waited until she reached him before heading toward the barn. She followed closely, her steps careful but steady. Inside the barn, the animals stirred restlessly. The sudden cold made them uneasy. Naya set the blanket aside and walked to the horse's stall. She placed her hand against the animal's neck, calming it with a steady touch. Billy watched her from the corner of his eye. She worked with animals the way he worked with tools, precise, grounded, and without wasted movement. He began hauling bales of hay while she filled the trough with water. Her arms moved with quiet strength, lifting the bucket without strain. When she set it down, she dipped her fingers into the water, feeling the temperature. She shook her head and pointed to the stove in the feed room, signaling it needed warming so the water wouldn't freeze later. Billy nodded. He appreciated that she noticed details before he did. As the chores continued, the snowfall thickened. Flakes drifted into the barn through gaps in the roof. Naya paused, raising her palm to catch a few, examining them with the curiosity of someone who had walked through harsh lands but still found small things worth noticing. She turned her hand slightly, letting the flakes melt against her skin. Billy watched her for a moment longer than he meant to. Something about her focus drew his attention. Not wonder exactly, but thoughtfulness, as if every new condition told her how to survive another day. After the animals were settled, they stepped back into the open. Snow now covered the ground in a thin but growing layer. Naya walked ahead, her footprints forming a neat line behind her. She stopped near the fence and crouched to inspect the wire. Overnight moisture had caused a section to sag. She pointed at the loose post. Billy retrieved the tools without needing explanation. As he tightened the wire, she held the post steady. The cold reddened her cheeks, but she didn't complain or hesitate. Her hands remained firm, bracing the wood even as wind pushed against her. When Billy finished, he stood and brushed the snow from his gloves. Naya straightened too, and for a brief moment their eyes met without tension. She wasn't judging him or seeking approval, just acknowledging the work completed together. He felt a small shift inside, subtle but unmistakable. They walked back to the house as the snow deepened. Naya's steps slowed slightly, and Billy noticed she was shivering beneath the blanket. He opened the door and gestured for her to go in first. She hesitated only long enough to read his intent, then stepped inside. The warmth of the stove spread through the room. She knelt beside it, rubbing her hands together to bring sensation back into her fingers. Billy filled a kettle and set it over the fire. As it heated, he glanced at the shelf where her belongings now rested neatly. The sight of it brought a quiet steadiness to him. She wasn't living out of fear anymore. She was settling. When the kettle began to steam, he placed 2 cups on the table. Naya approached and wrapped her hands around the warm metal, absorbing the heat with visible relief. She sat across from him, shoulders lowering slightly as comfort returned. After drinking, she took her deerskin dress and hung it near the stove to dry. The fabric had absorbed snow, darkening along the hem. She smoothed the edges with care, her fingers moving slowly along each seam. Billy watched her for a moment, noticing how she rebuilt herself quietly. One repaired garment, one reorganized shelf, one cautious step at a time. Later, she sat beside the small window and looked out at the snow-covered yard. She traced a short motion on the glass, signaling cold, then pointed to the barn. It was her way of saying the animals would need extra checking overnight. Billy understood. "I'll look again before dark," he said, keeping his tone even. Naya met his eyes and nodded once with a seriousness that matched his. As evening approached, the wind strengthened. Branches scraped lightly against the house. Naya folded the blanket around her shoulders and moved closer to the stove, but her gaze stayed fixed on the door as if listening through the shifting air. Billy noticed the tension in her posture. She wasn't afraid of the weather. She was remembering how danger often arrived when conditions became harsh. He stepped closer and lit another lamp to brighten the room. The simple act steadied her, though she didn't show it openly. When she finally relaxed enough to sit at the table, she placed her hand flat on the wood and looked at him with quiet certainty. "Safe here," she signed slowly, tapping her chest. Billy let the words sink in. He hadn't heard anyone say that about this house since the day he lost his family. Hearing it, even silently, settled something heavy inside him. He nodded once. "You are." Naya lowered her hand, accepting the answer without searching for more. Snow continued to fall outside, but the house held a warmth Billy hadn't felt in years. Not comfort exactly, something steadier, something earned. Their days were no longer separate tracks crossing the same land. They were beginning to move in the same direction. The snow had settled into a hardened crust by the time morning arrived. Billy stepped outside early, testing the ground with his boot before heading toward the corral. A thin veil of pale blue stretched across the sky, promising clearer weather, but the cold clung stubbornly to the land. Naya watched from the porch, wrapped tightly in her blanket. She noticed immediately when he saddled the horse. Her eyes narrowed with concern, and she moved closer, lowering the blanket enough to free her arms. She touched the mare's flank gently, then looked at Billy with a question already forming in her posture. He tightened the cinch and met her gaze. "Supply run. Won't be long." She searched his lips carefully, making sure she understood. The tension in her shoulders deepened anyway. She lifted her hands and signed slowly, "Danger outside." Then she pointed toward the distant ridge where the tracks from the previous day had been found. Billy didn't dismiss her worry. "I'll be careful." Her jaw tightened. She stepped closer and placed her hand around his wrist, not gripping, only holding long enough to make him pause. Her touch carried urgency, not fear. Then she signed again, more firmly, "Return before dark." Billy nodded. He swung into the saddle, adjusted his posture, and gave her a final look that carried reassurance he wasn't accustomed to offering. She stepped back as the horse began moving, watching him leave until he disappeared around the bend. The yard felt quiet in his absence, too still, too exposed. Naya remained by the fence for several minutes, reading the landscape the way some people read scripture. She checked the barn, the feed shed, the shutters, each item twice. Routine steadied her, but her eyes never settled completely. Inside the house, she prepared a small stew, chopping vegetables with precise movements. She stopped often, listening through vibration, making sure nothing outside shifted in a way that signaled approach. The air hummed with her alertness. Time passed slowly. She swept the floor, repaired a loose thread on her dress, and brushed snow from the porch planks, keeping herself occupied while tracking every small tremor that reached her through the ground. By early afternoon, she looked toward the hill again. Nothing moved. Her concern grew sharper. Billy rode toward the outpost with the same steady caution he had used for years. His mission was simple: gather hay twine, dried food, and a few metal fasteners. He didn't linger in town. He avoided conversation. He completed each errand with efficiency, driven partly by routine and partly by the memory of Naya's hand on his wrist. When he finished, he mounted up again. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying the smell of snow still resting between the hills. He urged the horse into a quicker pace, feeling a tug in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. Someone waiting for him. As he neared the ranch, he noticed smoke rising steadily from the chimney. A good sign. No trouble. No unexpected visitors. He slowed his horse deliberately before entering the yard, not wanting to startle Naya. She stepped out the moment she sensed the vibration of hooves, her face changing instantly from tension to relief. She walked toward him with brisk steps, scanning him quickly for injuries before acknowledging the supplies. Billy dismounted. Naya touched his coat sleeve, confirming he was unharmed. Then she signed a short series of words. "You returned fast." He gave a slight shrug. Didn't want to be away longer than needed. She absorbed that, her expression softening. For her, time alone on unfamiliar land carried more weight than she let on. Inside, she set the supplies on the table and cleared space for sorting. Billy noticed the order she used, grouping items by type, checking each bag by feel. She handed him a coil of rope, waiting until he gripped it firmly before releasing. During supper, she watched him more than usual. Every faint shift in his posture, every glance toward the window, she registered with careful attention. Her own breathing eased only after she finished evaluating the quiet of the night. After they ate, she gestured for him to sit near the stove. She took his coat, inspected the seams he hadn't noticed had frayed, and began reinforcing them. Her hands moved with steady accuracy, but this time she looked up more often, checking that he remained within sight. Billy watched her work, the lamplight casting soft shadows across her face. Something in him settled when he saw how seriously she took the act of keeping the house secure in his absence. When she finished, she placed the coat on the table and touched her chest with an open palm. The meaning was simple: glad you returned. Billy's breath slowed. So am I. Naya stepped back, absorbing the rare honesty in his voice. The tension she'd carried all day loosened visibly, though she kept her expression steady. She closed the shutters and checked each latch with her usual precision. Before retiring for the night, she paused near his chair. She reached out and laid her hand lightly over his for a brief moment, steady, deliberate, without hesitation. Billy didn't pull his hand away. He let the contact rest between them, grounding them both. When she withdrew, she did so slowly, leaving him with a warmth he hadn't expected to feel again. The storm outside had eased, but something inside the house had shifted more profoundly. They were not simply sharing space anymore. Naya's fear of losing the rare stability she'd found and Billy's unexpected awareness of her absence had drawn them closer in a way neither had spoken but both clearly felt. A day apart had revealed something neither of them could dismiss. They had begun to matter to each other. The snow that had fallen in recent days settled into a solid layer across the ranch, flattening the landscape and muting the usual sounds of the land. Morning came slowly, with a pale light filtering across the yard and turning the frost into a dull shimmer. Billy opened the front door and stepped outside, his boots pressing deep into the hardened snow. The cold sank straight through his coat, but the air felt clearer than it had in days. Behind him, the door creaked softly. Naya emerged with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her hair tied back again. She moved cautiously on the slippery steps, one hand brushing the railing. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she paused to feel the vibration beneath her. It had become part of her daily routine, reading the land before she took any step beyond the porch. Billy looked toward the barn, then glanced at her. "Animals first," he said, knowing she would read his lips. She nodded and followed him. Inside the barn, the scent of hay mixed with the faint warmth of sheltered livestock. The horse lifted its head as they entered. Naya moved toward the stall without hesitation, brushing snow from her sleeves and offering the horse a slow, calming touch. She spoke through her hands, not verbally, making quiet gestures near the animal's neck that conveyed reassurance in a language of motion. Billy filled the trough, watching how she worked. There was more confidence in her movements now, less hesitation, more assuredness about where things belonged. She no longer looked around the barn as if memorizing its layout. She moved as though she had lived there for months instead of days. He repaired a loose board on one of the stalls while she swept the straw into neat rows. The rhythm between them felt natural, almost instinctive. Whenever he shifted his position, she stepped aside without needing direction. When she needed him to hand her a tool, she tapped lightly on the wood, and he knew exactly what she wanted. Their silence was not empty. It was steady, practical, and surprisingly comfortable. When the chores were done, Naya lingered near the barn door. She glanced up at the roof, noticed a slight tilt in one section where snow had built up unevenly, and pointed it out. Billy followed her gesture and nodded. They carried a ladder together and positioned it under the sagging beam. Billy climbed while she stood at the bottom, holding the ladder firmly. She didn't take her eyes off him. The cold wind picked up, brushing strands of hair across her face, but she kept her stance solid. When he hammered the beam back into place, she felt the vibrations through the ladder and braced it more tightly. Once he climbed down, she inspected the roof herself, touching the wooden plank to ensure it held steady. Billy watched this with quiet admiration. She wasn't only helping. She was taking responsibility for the ranch as if it were her own. They returned to the house shortly before midday. Snow clung to their boots, melting into small puddles near the threshold. Naya knelt down and wiped the water from the floor, not as a chore, but as something she simply wanted to do. Billy noticed she didn't wait for him to tell her anything anymore. She was claiming her place through action. Inside the kitchen, she prepared vegetables for a stew, slicing them with sharp precision. Billy gathered firewood from the stack beside the stove, stacking each log carefully. When he finished, he noticed something new. Naya had placed her wooden comb and a small folded cloth on the shelf he built for her. 2 items she used every morning. 2 items she trusted enough to leave in the open. He watched her stir the pot, the steam rising gently around her face. Her expression carried a calm he hadn't seen in her the first days. She moved with a quiet confidence, as though the house had begun to feel like hers. While the stew cooked, Billy stepped outside to check the perimeter. Naya followed a moment later, holding his repaired coat. She handed it to him with a steady look, ensuring he wore it before he continued walking the fence line. He accepted it without protest and slipped his arms through the sleeves. Together, they walked the length of the property. Snow crunched under their boots, leaving parallel tracks stretching behind them. Naya stopped near the southern fence to inspect the area where the stranger's tracks had appeared earlier in the week. She crouched, brushed a thin layer of snow aside, and examined the ground. No new prints, no disturbed soil. She glanced at him and signed, clear. Billy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. On the way back, Naya noticed a wooden crate half buried near the old shed. She dug around it with her hands and pulled it free. Inside were rusted metal hooks and an old lantern, items Billy had forgotten years ago. She held the lantern up, assessing its weight and condition. He walked over. Think it can be fixed? She traced the edge of the dented metal with her thumb and nodded slowly. Her fingers formed a sign he understood. Try. Back inside, they sat at the table with the lantern between them. She dismantled it piece by piece, laying each part on a cloth. Billy watched with restrained interest. She examined the wick, adjusted the hinge, and scraped rust from the rim. Her hands never rushed. She treated the object the same way she approached everything, calm, steady, focused. When she finished, she assembled it again and pushed it toward him. She struck a match and offered it. Billy lit the wick, and a soft flame rose inside the glass. The lantern glowed steadily, illuminating the room with a warm, subtle light. Naya allowed herself a small, genuine smile. It was the first he had seen from her, quiet, almost hidden, but unmistakably real. Billy felt something shift inside him. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but significant. Her smile wasn't about the lantern. It was about creating something that had a place in this house. Something she had restored. Something that stayed. As evening settled, they ate their stew near the stove. The flames reflected off the metal surface of the repaired lantern, casting long shadows across the wall. Naya watched the light for a while, then looked at him. She tapped the table gently and signed one word, home. Billy didn't speak at first. The word caught him off guard, not because he disagreed, but because he had never expected to hear or see that word directed at this house again. He leaned forward. You're safe here, he said clearly, so she could read his lips without doubt. As long as you want. Naya's breath steadied. She nodded once, slowly, then placed her hand on the table near his. This time, she didn't hesitate. Her fingers stayed there, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her skin. Billy didn't pull away. He rested his hand beside hers, leaving the distance small enough to cross without touching, but close enough to mean something. Outside, the wind rose again, pushing snow against the shutters. Inside, the house held the quiet weight of two lives beginning to settle into one place. The transformation was subtle. No declarations, no dramatic gestures. Just shared work, shared space, and the understanding that neither of them wanted to leave. The ranch no longer felt like a place Billy endured. It felt like a place he was building again, this time with someone who chose to stay. The final stretch of winter wind arrived with a low, steady push across the open land. It swept through the ranch before sunrise, rattling loose snow from the rooftops and bending the bare branches behind the barn. Billy stood at the window, watching the light gather along the ridge, his breath slow and controlled. Something in him felt different that morning, more certain, more grounded. The house behind him was warm, carrying the faint sound of Naya moving in the kitchen. She stepped into the main room moments later, her hair tied with the same thin ribbon she had used since arriving. She carried a small bowl of water and a cloth to wipe the table, her motions calm and familiar. When she glanced at Billy, she paused, trying to read the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't distressed, but he wasn't relaxed either. She tilted her head slightly, asking without signing. Billy shook his head gently. Nothing wrong, he said, slowly so she could follow his lips. Just thinking. Naya studied him for another moment before returning to her task. She wiped the table, folded the cloth, and set it aside. Her expression was peaceful, but the air around her held a quiet questioning, as though she sensed something important was settling into place. Outside, the weather gave no immediate threat. The sky was clear. The wind moved steadily, but without violence. Billy decided they should check the property before the sun climbed too high. Naya dressed in her warmest layers and joined him without hesitation. They walked in silence through the yard. Their footsteps left paired marks on the snow, the lines running perfectly parallel. The cold sharpened their breath, turning it into thin clouds that drifted behind them as they moved toward the southern fence. Naya stopped first. She knelt and touched a section of the wire, as if confirming a thought. The metal was firm, the post secure, no sign of recent disturbance. She stood and brushed snow from her hands. Billy watched her carefully. There was something in her movements today, slower, more deliberate, as though she were weighing each moment instead of rushing to the next shore. They continued walking. When they reached the small rise overlooking the field, Naya paused again. She looked out across the land, not scanning for danger this time, but observing the stretch of snow-covered earth as if seeing it for the first time with ease instead of fear. Billy stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Naya turned her head, focusing on his lips. She lifted her hands slowly and signed, different now. She tapped her chest and then gestured around the land. He understood. The ranch no longer felt like a stopping place for her. It had become something she recognized as stable. They headed back to the barn and spent the late morning feeding the animals. Naya brushed the horse with long, steady strokes, her expression softening each time the animal pressed its head toward her. Billy repaired a loose hinge, but his attention drifted to her often. She worked without fear, without restlessness, as if she had finally allowed herself to breathe fully. When they returned to the house, Naya stirred a pot of stew while Billy brought in extra wood for the evening. He noticed her humming, not with sound, but with subtle movement in her shoulders and the faint rhythm of her breath. She didn't realize she was doing it. It was the closest he had seen her come to complete ease. As the stew simmered, the warm scent drifted through the house. Naya set 2 bowls on the table, then sat across from Billy. They ate slowly, with occasional glances that lingered longer than necessary. After the meal, Naya stood and walked to the shelf he had built for her. She reached up and touched each item she had placed there: her wooden comb, folded cloths, her small pouch, and the repaired lantern they fixed together. Her hands paused on the lantern. Her fingers pressed lightly against the metal. She turned back toward him. Her expression was steady, but her eyes held a depth he had not seen from her before. She walked closer, stopping beside the table. She lifted her hands and signed. "I stay, if you want." Billy's breath caught, not with shock, but with a powerful steadiness spreading through him. He had felt this moment forming for days. He had sensed it in every silent exchange, every shared task, every glance that lasted longer than the one before it. He stood and faced her. "Naya," he said slowly, his voice low but certain. "You belong here." Her eyes softened instantly. She stepped closer so she could read every detail on his face. She touched her palm to her chest, then extended it toward him with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of trust. Billy reached forward and took her hand gently. His grip was firm, warm, certain. He didn't speak further. He didn't need to. Naya's breathing changed, deeper, steadier. She stepped closer until there was no space left between their hands. Her fingers curled around his, holding him with a quiet certainty that came from survival, not romance. It was the kind of contact formed by 2 people who had lived without safety for too long and had finally found it in the same place. The moment held for several long seconds. Then Naya guided him toward the window. She pointed to the land outside, the snow-covered yard, the barn, the field stretching toward the ridge. She signed slowly. "We build together. Not just work. Life." Billy swallowed hard. The simplicity of the idea hit him harder than any words spoken aloud could have. For years, the ranch had been a place he endured, a place where he survived, not where he lived. Now, it was changing because she had chosen it. He nodded, his voice thick but sure. "Yes, together." Naya exhaled with visible relief. Her smile was small but deeply sincere. She touched his arm, letting her hand rest there longer than any previous moment. They spent the afternoon reinforcing the house for the last stretch of winter. Naya nailed blankets over drafty sections. Billy sealed gaps in the windows. Every task they completed together felt like a step towards something permanent. Later, as dusk covered the ranch, they stood near the doorway. The lantern they had repaired glowed on the table behind them, steady and warm. Naya reached for his hand again, not tentative this time, but with clear intention. Billy intertwined his fingers with hers, and the silence between them shifted from uncertainty to promise. They were no longer two people thrown together by need. They were partners building a future through quiet loyalty and the deliberate act of staying. As night settled across Dust Bend, the house no longer echoed with old emptiness. It carried the soundless rhythm of two lives joined by choice. Their story ended not with grand declarations, but with a steady, enduring truth. She stayed, he stayed, and together they found peace in a life they built side by side.